Yesterday, Nebraska Senator Pete Ricketts announced legislation he says will boost the retirement income of millions of seniors in Nebraska and across the country. Our Brent Weber is on your side in the newsroom now with more on what Ricketts is calling the Social Security Check Tax Cut Act. Brent, tell us more about this.
Well, thanks, Jacqueline. This is Ricketts' third piece of legislation under what he calls his Proven Nebraska Solutions Ready for America package. Now, after initial readings, that bill was sent to the Senate Finance Committee. The title of the bill on record, a little less catchy than Social Security Check Tax Cut Act. Ricketts sees Senate Bill 2800 as something he can apply Nebraska's strategy to. Ricketts sees Senate Bill 2800 as something he can apply Nebraska's strategy to. Remember, he signed legislation here to phase out state taxes on Social Security benefits. To get a better understanding of tax on Social Security income, I turned to tax policy scholar Victoria Hanneman at Creighton School of Law.
Social Security was not taxed when the program was started. But it's important to keep in mind that when Social Security as a program was established, corporate taxes were way higher, taxes at death were way higher, and the top income tax rate was almost double what it is today. Now, the benefits were not taxed until the program started running on fumes around 1983.
The program is still on fumes, and how you cut these taxes matters.
In Minnesota, when a state tax cut was proposed to eliminate taxation on Social Security benefits, the study showed that about 50% of the benefit from the tax cut flows to households making more than $143,000 per year.
She thinks raising current thresholds would be a better place to start.
So right now, those income thresholds are between $25,000 and I think right now $44,000. And those figures have not been indexed for inflation, so they are really out of date. You could deliver a targeted tax cut by indexing those amounts for inflation. It's just, if you're interested in the political theater of a tax cut, it's not as flashy.
At the end of the day, Social Security has political problems.
I also say that this type of legislation is actually a little bit tiresome because it's not new. As to whether or not it's politically feasible, amending Social Security requires 60 votes in the Senate. And neither party has held 60 seats since the 1970s. And so Ricketts' proposal will go nowhere unless it's backed by bipartisan support, which was less of a challenge for him when he was governor in a politically conservative state.
On your side in Omaha, Brent Weber, 6 News.
All right, thank you, Brent. Meantime, a link to the proposed bill can be found on our website, WOWT.com. All right, still to come.